song is called Oog Waltz, and it's Eskimo for Baby Owl. So it's a Canadian, French-Canadian tune, Oog Waltz. So we picked out some tunes to play for you on concertina and bass and fiddle that I think were played or written in this area. Some of them from maybe late 1700s, 1800s, and some we picked out and found that I believe maybe from the 1940s, around the time of the local flood that John's going to talk about today. And so this first tune, a fiddle tune we want to play, is what they call it now is the name of the tune. They say is Hell Up Mud Creek. But I think it's very likely that it was Hell Up Elk Creek, and it was written in the 40s, and it very well may have been related to the disastrous flood that happened in this area. So a lot of the old fiddlers used to significant that happened in their lives. They wrote a fiddle tune about it and named it after. So it was a pretty cool tradition, and so when they played the tune, it reminded everyone of what happened. So it's like a musical newspaper. And so this is Hell Up Mud Creek, but I think the original title might have been Hell Up Elk Creek because it originated from this area. Okay. Yeah, we play it. So Hell Up Elk Creek. So we're just going to get our concertina out and we're going to play a little waltz. It's probably, this waltz is not from this area, but it sounds old. Actually, it was written just a few years ago by, what was his name? Larry Younger, no relation to Jay Younger, who wrote Ashokan Farewell. But Larry Younger is a contradance musician, writes great songs and waltzes. And so we're going to do a duet, and this is a medley of two waltzes that Larry Younger wrote, Jim and Judy's Wedding and Leona Tuttle. So the story is Jim and Judy's wedding. He, as a wedding gift for this couple, he wrote a nice waltz for them, and he ended up getting divorced a few years later. I'm not supposed to tell that story, but it's true. And Leona Tuttle was Larry's great aunt for her, I think it was her 100th birthday, and she wrote this waltz for her. So I'm going to play you both of these waltzes. See if I remember it.
but you probably can't see it, most of you, because it's down here. But this was made in 1905. It's over 100 years old by the inventor of the concertina, Charles Wheatstone. And it was a real find I got off of eBay, but so there it is. I just think it's pretty, so.
Tell the story about what that guy asked you when we were playing at the farmer's market.
Oh yeah, somebody asked us when the expo opened, if you remember the expo, out on, across from, what is the name of that place now?
Excel.
Yeah.
Somebody asked us to play some music, and so I was playing the concertina, and you don't see these very often in these here parts, and somebody said, "Where's that music coming from? Do you have a little tape recorder inside of there?"
So we'd like to play one more fiddle tune for you, and let John speak. We'll get out of his way. There's Tony Jones.
Hey.
I was just going to invite everyone to come to the Happy Valley Fiddlers Convention on Labor Day weekend.
What's up, TJ?
On Tony's farm. It's a great time. It's like a family reunion for everyone. So this last tune we're going to play is fiddle tune, and I believe it originated from this area too. And it's about a meeting house, which I think the churches used to be called meeting houses. John shared that with me earlier today. And a lot of fiddle tunes were named after something interesting that happened to the fiddler that wrote the tune. And the name of this fiddle tune is Old Yellow Dog Come Trotting Through the Meeting House. And apparently they were having some worship service in some meeting house around there in the middle of the service. This old yellow dog comes just walking right through the meeting house. And it just was something that everyone remembered, and some fiddler sat down, wrote a fiddle tune, and named it that. But I need your help for this. There's some fiddle tunes that have words to them. And a lot of times the old-time fiddlers would be playing and playing, playing several times around, and then they'd start singing the words to it that they made up, and then go back to playing. So the words are really easy, and after maybe second time around, I'll sing it to help you. But it's really easy. It's just old yellow dog coming trotting through the meeting house. And it repeats, how many times? 4 times or something. And then the chorus is, good boys here, good gals there. Good boys here down in North Carolina. And so I'll try to sing it to help you out. But if you could sing along with me. Old yellow dog coming trotting through the meeting house. And then good boys here, good gals there. Down in North Carolina. So if you feel like it, come on and sing along like they used to do a couple 100 years ago, or 40 years ago. Where are we? 2022?
Yes.
100 years ago. Yellow dog come trot through the meeting house, trot through the meeting house, trot through the meeting house. Oh, yellow dog come trot through the meeting house down in North Carolina. Good boys here, good girls there. Good boys here down in North Carolina. Oh, yellow dog come trot through the meeting house, trot through the meeting house, trot through the meeting house. Oh, yellow dog come trot through the meeting house down in North Carolina. Good boys here. good girls there, good boys here down in North Carolina. Hey,
Bob, can you give us one more?
I'd love to. Let's do another concertina song.
Oh, no, do
Yeah.
the fiddle song. Do the fiddle.
Let's do Ashokan Farewell.
I
Yeah.
did it.
Everyone loves that.
Yes.
I'd like to hear Ashokan Farewell.
Yes.
Yeah, by request. Or should we do Stairway to Heaven? There was a story about a band that was playing somewhere in a restaurant, and they had a big poster up in front of the stage, and instead of taking a request, they put how much they would charge to play certain requests. And like Stairway to Heaven was like $100. Wagon Wheel was like $500.
Oh my.
So this is another song. It was made popular from the PBS documentary, The Civil War. That who wrote that?
Jay Unger.
Who was the producer of that?
Burns. Oh,
Burns.
yeah.
Ken Burns.
Yeah,
Ken Burns.
Ken Burns. And I'll tell you a quick story about this because this is pretty interesting. Jay Unger wrote this song, and he wrote it during a fiddlers convention up in the Catskills in New York State, and it was called Ashokan, and teaching fiddle and lessons and dancing and playing. And it was the end of the event, and everyone was sad to leave, like we always are at the end of a fiddlers convention. And so he wrote the song called Ashokan Farewell. And Ken Burns, when he was producing the documentary for the Civil War, asked Penn if he could use the song as a soundtrack for his documentary. And that's where the song, and a lot of people think it's a song from the Civil War, but it was written in the 1970s.
Oh.
But it has that old-timey sound to it. So this is a Ashokan Farewell. I'll let you start, and then I'll play the second.
Okay. We're gonna start with.
No. all over the world. You know, even after you pass on, to have it there, what a gift that must be. So, anyway, thanks for listening, and Sandra, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Roberta. Appreciate you doing that for us today. I want to thank all of you for being here today. If you've not been here before and you don't know, the restrooms are in the end of this little white building that we call the summer. And two, when you leave here today, if you'll take one of these slips of paper, the Happy Valley Filling Station is giving 10% of what you purchased there back to the fort. So I'm going to send you home with these. I'll lay them here on this table. If you want to take one, we appreciate that. So I want to, first of all, say happy birthday to Eliza Bishop, who's in our group, and we thank her for being here today. Yeah. And I also want to introduce you to our new site director, Bob Myers. Colonial outfit. Bob comes from 28 years of working service at the Rendezvous Mountain. He's also a minister, and so we're excited to have him as part of our family. And his daughter Rebecca, who is over here in her nice little outfit, she is, so we're really getting 2 for 1. We're getting Bob as the site director and Rebecca as our new volunteer. So Rebecca's 15 years old. She's homeschooled. She's actually in the 11th grade. She wants to be a history major when she grows up, and she's been reenacting for about 8 years now. Her favorite part, I think, is outdoor cooking. Is that right? Is that what you like?
Yeah, and just dressing up in the outfit.
There you go. That's what it's all about. So I think most of you know John. John's a native of Caldwell County and local historian, but I wanted you to know a little bit more about him. He started his early career and employment as working for the furniture factories or the furniture industry. He served in the military as a communications center specialist. His community involvement is very long, but just to point out a few, he's been the director, past director of the Caldwell Heritage Museum, and he serves on the Blue Ridge Energy's Caldwell Advisory Committee. He's put in local history columns for the Lenore News Topic. He's a charter member of the Caldwell County Genealogical Society. He's a member of the Yadkin Baptist Church here in Patterson. He's a Sunday school teacher, choir member, and served on various committees, and he's the interim director of music since 2021. He's compiled family histories on the families of Hawkins, Pipes, Green, Day, Robbins, and Barlow. So if you have any of those in your family, you might want to check with John before you leave today. He's been awarded the North Carolina Society of Historians, the Caldwell County Schools Hall of Honor. John, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Sandra. 82 years ago today, on August 13, 1940, in the mountains of western North Carolina, an event of epic proportions occurred that is still being discussed. And that's our purpose for being here today. Now, even those of us who are not old enough to have firsthand memories of it, or who were born to people that it occurred to, who did experience it, have our own stories to tell. And I'm going to begin with some official information. An article written by Philip Gerard, published in Our State magazine in May of 2018, gives information about the weather conditions that precipitated the flood of 1940. On August 11, a Category 2 storm hit Beaufort, South Carolina, and moved inland into Georgia and unpredictably hooked north along the Appalachians. The unrelenting rainfall added to more than 21 inches of rain that had already fallen during the month of August, set the stage for the most devastating catastrophe that the northwestern mountains of North Carolina have ever known. And I quote directly from the Our State article. The disaster goes down in history as the Great Flood of 1940, but it's really many floods of the Watauga, Yadkin, Little Tennessee, Tuckasegee, New, and French Broad rivers, of Stony Fork Creek and Linville Creek at Swift Ford Branch, and 100 other creeks in Watauga, Ashe, Wilkes, Haywood, Caldwell, and other mountain counties. Now, it had rained almost without ceasing for more than a week, and at 5 o'clock on the evening of the flood, the rain came down harder and harder until the streams everywhere in the territory could be seen rapidly rising. Several families who lived near the streams left home before dark. As the downpour showed no signs of diminishing, the people began to feel excited and uneasy. The darker it grew, the harder the rain fell. About 9 o'clock, the wind began to blow. Lightning flashed, and it seems that the rain was no longer coming down in drops, but in solid sheets of water. The hillsides and steep mountain slopes were already saturated by long continued rains, and now the cloudburst reached its greatest intensity. Great masses of earth, together with uprooted green trees, logs, and huge stones, were torn from age-old moorings, and rending noises awful to hear. Slides burst out that were hundreds of feet in length and breadth, and of considerable depth. Tremendous damage came to those who lived at the foot of the Blue Ridge. Within a space of less than a half mile, 4 families lost their homes. There were about 50 slides from the steep mountains and hills in the Deep Gap section. And one of the hardest hit areas was the little Watauga County Valley community of Stony Fork, where my mother grew up. Several members of her family were involved, and a cousin was among the drowning victims. Now, without a doubt, the worst tragedy of the flood concerns the family of Andy and Eliza Green, consisting of the parents, 3 sons, and 3 daughters. The oldest son was not at home when the flood occurred. Andy and the 3 daughters were carried away in the rushing waters, and their bodies were found the next day. Eliza and the 2 younger sons suffered narrow escapes. Each landed in a separate drift, and though badly injured, they survived the flood. The youngest son, who was age 7, achieved his 15 minutes of fame by afterward taking interested people to the drift where he had spent the night. When he was asked if he were afraid, he is quoted as saying, "No, I wasn't a bit afraid, didn't even cry either. There were pretty little lights around me, and I could hear Mama not far from me calling for somebody." The funeral for Andy and his 3 daughters was held a few days later at Stony Fork Baptist Church. It is the only known time in the history of the church that a funeral service was held for 4 members of the same family at the same time. The father and the 3 daughters were buried in a large one-mound grave in the church cemetery. The only family member who could attend the service was the oldest son. Eliza and her other 2 sons were hospitalized in Boone. Now, the only known fatality of a Caldwell County person was Nina Todd from Buffalo Cove, who was visiting among her several relatives in Stony Fork. The night she was drowned, she was with my mother's sister, my Aunt Lucy, and her husband, Worth Green, and they had sought refuge at the home of their neighbor, Zeb Green. Now, curious about the storm, Nina, Zeb, Aunt Lucy, and Uncle Worth had stepped out on the porch of the house. Aunt Lucy, thinking she heard her baby crying, went back inside. When she was checking on her daughter, a huge wave of water washed the other 3 off the porch. Uncle Worth grabbed a cedar tree that was adjacent to the porch, climbed the tree, thus saving his life. He called Aunt Lucy, who was inside the house, letting her know that he was safe. Now, apparently at some point the water abated to some degree, and he was able to climb down and rejoin his family. And the other 2 were swept to their death, and their bodies were carried several miles down Stony Fork Creek all the way to Ferguson in Wilkes County, further than any other victim. Now, I think I am correct in stating that Nina's body was the last to be recovered a week afterward. The searchers had almost given up hope when a little boy playing along the riverbank happened to see her hand and part of an arm sticking out of a sandbar, and her body was taken from the same spot where Zeb Green's body was recovered a few days later. If I can deviate for just a minute, Nina's brother, Riley Todd, is here today, sitting back there on the left in the very back. Maybe he'll have some things he can say to us later. A story that I heard repeatedly concerns my grandmother's house. My widowed grandmother and her children who were still living at home were asleep in the house. While they were asleep, the current came with such a terrific force that it moved the house downstream about 300 yards where it lodged against an uprooted tree. When the house suddenly came to rest, a few bricks from the chimney fell on the tin roof, waking all of them. One of my cousins remembers being told that when grandmother got out of bed, she was standing in water up to her ankles. They started to a neighbor's house, which is about a half a mile away as the crow flies, but every way they tried to go was blocked. And my Uncle Joe is quoted as saying, "I know we can't run from God, but we've got to get to higher ground." They eventually made it to the neighbor's house by a long circuitous route. And another story that I've heard many times comes from my own parents, and it happened here in Caldwell County. Dad was working in Lenore, and he was part of a group of people who rode to and from work together each day. The afternoon of August 13, they started home, and they got about 2 miles on the Buffalo Cove Road, and they came to an impasse where they could not cross a low water bridge. After some deliberation, my dad and 2 of his friends decided they could swim across the creek and walk the rest of the way home. They left their watches, their wallets, and perhaps some other valuables with Mr. Asa Baker, who lived near the bridge. And Mr. Baker insisted on putting the items in a flour sack, tying the sack, and if I remember correctly, locked the sack in a cabinet or a chest. He assured them that they would find their items just as they had left them when they returned. And indeed, that was the case. Now, meanwhile, my mother was at home with her 4-month-old baby. She could look out her back windows and see the water from Buffalo Creek in the field behind the house getting closer and closer as the rains continued. She knew she could not go anywhere in the driving rain, and she was concerned about my dad, not knowing if he were safe or if he would be able to get home. She said later that when he finally completed the 3-mile walk home, she had never been so glad to see anyone in her entire life. Now, when something he considered newsworthy was happening, my mother's grandfather Green would say, "Now we're going to hear from this." Mother told Dad that night, as my grandpa Green would say, "We're going to hear from this." She did not realize that her grandfather in Watauga County was experiencing much worse conditions than she was, and it would be a day or perhaps 2 before she learned that he was safe, but that her cousin Nina Todd had been drowned in the flood. Now, Mary Todd Miller, about 10 years of age, younger sister of Nina, tells that the family sought refuge that night in the Buffalo Cove Church, which is adjacent to the Todd home. They held hands and waded through a branch that was waist deep. Another sister, Sadie, about 8, remembers that her daddy carried her through that branch. And they were joined by the family of Avery Hawkins, my dad's brother, who lived just up the road, and my cousin Edna Hawkins, who would have been about 6 years old, remembers sleeping in the pulpit area of the church and not being afraid. Now, much of my information concerns Watauga County for 2 reasons. One, the oral stories I heard involved, for the most part, my mother's Watauga County relatives. And second, the Stony Fork community's involvement has been documented in a book called A Disastrous Flood, written by Mrs. Ivory C. Green. The book is no longer in print, but I have borrowed its title for this presentation. And much of the almost poetic description I used earlier is quoted directly from the book. Now, the residents of Stony Fork community, like so many other rural communities of a few generations ago, were all related to each other and to the book's author as well. And so the author wisely limits her book to the Stony Fork Valley where she lived and where she was most knowledgeable about what happened. And she makes only passing references to other locations. But one of the other areas that she does mention is Howard's Knob, a well-known mountain overlooking the town of Boone. She states that it is cracked near the top as a result of floodwaters. Other mountains marked by the ponderous avalanches still will always show signs of the flood's disaster. And she also states that several other counties suffered heavy losses, especially Wilkes. Crops were damaged badly, and much property was destroyed in North Wilkesboro, totaling several $million. The highways were cut, their services broken, and many stretches of them were covered with stones, small trees, and rubbish deposited by landslides. Bridges were wrecked, and several were carried away entirely by the flood waters. The Yadkin in Wilkes rose to unprecedented heights, from 4 to 6 feet higher than the previous record heights of the flood waters of July 15, 1916. It was reported that the Watauga River was 6 feet higher than it had been in the 1916 flood. Now, one story regarding Wilkes County I'm going to quote directly from the book. Only one life was lost in Wilkes County. Miss Opaline Smith of Angiers, North Carolina, was drowned in the high waters near Cub Creek Bridge east of Wilkesboro. She and her escort, Wade Gilbert, were riding in a car on their way to Boone when the car stalled in the waters. In great despair, they called for help. Soon a large crowd was around the scene and offered assistance. One of the men threw a wire within reach of Mr. Gilbert. Grasping it with one hand and holding the girl with the other, he was pulled toward safety. The two would have been rescued in this manner had it not been for some live wires with which the girl came into contact. These tore her from Mr. Gilbert's grasp. He, however, was rescued and taken to the Wilkes Hospital, where he recovered. Miss Smith's body was taken from the water a few hours later. Angiers in Harnett County, so I'm assuming Miss Smith was a non-resident. And since Gilbert is a Wilkes County name, perhaps the man was native to the area. And other than Gilbert being called an escort, the connection between the two people or their reason for being out that night is not stated. And I'm also quoting some information that the book has about the Caldwell County area. Several sections in Caldwell County suffered heavy losses of crops and property, but no lives reported lost. Reverend and Mrs. Johnny Crisp reported they were waterbound in their home for 3 days. The two rivers, Johns and Mulberry, which flow near their home, were out on their banks and spread over their farm, covering such a wide area it was impossible to get out without wading the deep waters. Reverend Crisp realized the danger of the water and ran to the home of one of his daughters and helped her get her children out of the house just before it swept away by the turbulent torrent. And Gerard's article in Our State has the following to say. South of Grandfather Mountain in Caldwell County, in the rugged, remote Pisgah National Forest, Wilson's Creek careens through its deep, steep-walled gorge with alarming force toward the small community of Mortimer. The town was hastily constructed in 1904 to house about 800 employees of the Ritter Lumber Company timber and sawmill operation, plus a textile mill. Ritter shut down its timber operation in 1916 after Wilson's Creek flooded and wiped out the railroad. By 1940, Mortimer includes homes, a smithy, a school, a church, a movie house, and even a hotel, the Laurel Inn. It was also home to the Civilian Conservation Corps Camp F5, which had taken over the warehouse buildings. But then on August 13, Wilson's Creek engulfs the creekside town with a flood cresting to 94 feet, and Mortimer never recovers. Now, I'm sure there are many stories that could be told about other areas of Caldwell, particularly those along the major waterways, and perhaps you will have some that you can tell when we have our sharing time in just a few minutes. Now, those of you who have heard me before know that when I speak, I like to take a light-hearted approach. However, there is no place for humor in this presentation. The theme is much too tragic. But let's conclude by going back to Watauga County. Stony Fork is still a rural community in the Deep Gap area of Watauga County. As with all rural communities, newcomers have moved into the valley, but some of the people still living there, including 3 of my cousins, are descendants of the ones who were directly affected by the flood. My grandmother's house, the one that floated, is still standing. It's owned by a cousin who uses it as rental property. The Zeb Green house, which was built in the 1850s, is owned by a member of his family. I'm not sure if it is her permanent residence or she just uses it as a seasonal residence. The Stony Fork Church Cemetery has the graves of some of the flood victims, as well as other members of their family who have later joined them. Now, at the risk of seeming didactic, let's focus for just a few minutes on those people in the little Stony Fork Valley on that fateful night. Some lost family members, and some suffered bodily injury. Many lost homes and material possessions. Most were farmers. None were wealthy. A citizen of the area has described them as people of great faith and great resilience who simply picked up the pieces and carried on. To my knowledge, other than some assistance from the American Red Cross, no government aid or social programs were available to them. They recovered primarily through their own ingenuity, their sense of community, and their faith in God. And what an example they have set for all of us as we face the storms of life. Now, I'll be glad to hear what you have to say and try to answer any questions, hear your comments, whatever. Riley? This is Riley Todd, who is a brother of Nina, whom I mentioned, and he has some first-hand experience with, because he was one of the people who went to the church. Come on over here, Riley, where people can hear you.
That Bob Cole makes pretty fiddles, don't he?
Yes, he does. You got a plug, a free plug there.
I know. Oh, he'll get me. I'll pay for it.
What's that?
Just get as close to you.
Okay. I was 12 years old in 1940. Most of you are familiar with Buffalo Cove, Todd's store. That's where I grew up. Back in, the store was facing, as you go in, was facing the road, and there's a little creek went right in front of the store. Then Joe's Fork Creek was over the other side. But that day, this one thing about the store, my dad came out of World War I and bought that in 1923 or 4 or something. Anyway, if you go up there, look at an old gas tank right beside the store. I used to pump that thing up and sell gas for 15 cents a gallon. Anyway, it rained, and at 12 years old, I didn't think anything about it, but as the water got up that night, as Johnny said, we all went up to the church. And Abe Hawkins, who lived above there, his family came down and stayed in the church. I was talking to my sister, Mary Miller, married her, but she said she remembered somebody brought some quilts and laid in there at the pulpit area, and her and some of those girls slept in there, laid there. But my mother was talking, and it's kind of sad, but she said, well, he looks real bad here, but my sister, who was 15 years old, was in Stony Fork, Nina, said Nina will be fine. There's not any place up there to flood. Well, we didn't know at the time that she lost her life. But we stayed in that church. The next day we come out, and you remember the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CC camps? They was up the road about a mile above the store, and I think it was Zach Watson that walked from Duggar back into Stony Fork and come in there and told my dad that my sister had been washed away. And some of those CC boys, they went up there hunting people. Anyway, it was several days before we knew anything, and I remember Zach came back and told Dad. And like Johnny said, her body was almost 20 miles away. That boy found her in the sandbar. But it was a bad time, but we had a lot of support, and I don't know anything else. If anybody has a question, I might answer it.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you, John.
Anything you want to ask him?
John, I got a question.
Okay.
4-month-old in your mama's house.
I'm sorry.
Who was the 4-month-old in your mama's house? Just your brother?
Me. I told you I didn't want to insert any humor. That's why I didn't say it was me. Yes.
I grew up hearing the story about the town, actually down near the river behind where I live. But the young man that found her was Bergen Braswell. I think I said his first name correctly, Bergen. Wesley Braswell's son, and that was my mother's first cousin. So I heard those stories, or that story, off and on by my mother talking about it to different people. But that was a long distance for her to be washed from where she was all the way to the other side of the, in other words, the mouth of Stony Fork. It put her over on the other side, up into, next to a cornfield.
Which must have been a lot of force on that creek. From what I've determined, she and Zeb Green, the two that were knocked off of that course, were the only two that were taken that far. The others that died were pretty much there in the local area, were found in the Stony Fork area.
Why was it raining so much? Was it part of a hurricane or?
Yes, there was a hurricane.
Do you know the name?
Not that I know of. Also, my mother told me it had been an especially wet summer. One of those summers, when there'd been lots of rain. And then August, apparently, the rain began in full force, and then that hurricane came in.
John, did that water stay up for hours or days?
That's a question I cannot answer. Well, according to the thing that Mr. Chris said, they were in their home for 3 days. I would say it was probably several days before things got anywhere near back to normal. The book that the lady wrote about it describes the day of the green funeral of the man and his 3 daughters as being an especially beautiful sunny day, which was so ironic considering what they were there and where they were gathering in a church for a funeral for 4 people.
John, was the flood the reason the Army Corps of Engineers built the Kerscott Dam?
I don't know. It could have been an outgrowth of it some years later, because that came some years later. Okay, any others?
Was Wilkesboro also underwater during that time?
I don't know a whole lot about Wilkesboro other than what I've shared with you. And she says that there was several $1 million worth of damage done, but she does not give any details in her book about Wilkesboro. Of course, obviously, that's not part of what she's writing about. You know, some of these things, and I'd like to challenge somebody to do it, go back and get the old newspapers from Wilkesboro and Lenore and the other areas and see what they have to say about the flood. I found one in a Lenore paper, one reference to flooded streets of Lenore, and that's all they said. I'm sure there was more to it than that.
There is an article that you can look back in, and if you type in, this occurred in Warstown, if you type in onion knob, it will bring up a the story about the deaths over there. And it's unclear to me because they're talking about the house that slid over the mudslide and killed, I want to say 2 children, one of which was washed away, another one I don't think was found. But it talks about the house sliding down the hill and then being washed away in the river. So they have to leave the little river on the other side and actually Alexander County out. The house may start in Lewis County. But that account is available and you can find it with just a little bit of search on.
You said,
No correlation between that story and anything here in that account of it, so it's a completely different account.
right. And you said Onion Knob?
Onion Knob is adjacent to Russell County.
Okay. Our state article that I quoted earlier indicates that it was a wide area that was affected. And but as I say, my knowledge is limited to hearsay in the book that I have.
Recently on the Caldwell County history site, they had pictures, aerial pictures of the flood from different sections of the county. So that might be something you might want to go back and look on that site to see if you can pull those pictures up.
Okay. That was the Caldwell County.
Caldwell County history site.
Ben, send me a link to that if you've got it.
What was the date of our state magazine article? Do you have that information? I'm reading that.
May 2018 issue.
Okay, what year?
2018.
Oh, sorry.
From the time I was fascinated with the Edgemont community and all that kind of stuff, because we would rent a cabin up there every summer, and my uncle owned a cabin up there, and so I grew up seeing all the remnants up there of the train and the buildings, and I have a hard time visualizing what a thriving community that was that is absolutely gone. And how much water there must have been coming through the gorge there to take a whole factory and a whole community and just railroad tracks, trestles and everything and take it out.
Makes you wonder how that the old train station survived.
That's true. That's true.
Well, one of the things that I stop and think about, how in the world and her children survive a house floating 300 yards, and how did they survive? How did the house survive and it's still being used today? I mean, it had some repair work, obviously, but
Like to know who built that house.
yeah. You know, I wish I had asked more questions of those people when they were still here. I did ask my mother's younger brother not too long before he died a few questions, and he told me a few things about the flood particularly. But now my family, they talked about it, but it wasn't the subject of conversation every time we got together. But it would be something that would be mentioned occasionally, and so I've heard these stories in family gatherings off and on all my life. Any others?
Our house, we weren't living there at the time. My family stories that the water got up and there were 6 inches of mud inside the house, but the house stayed where it was at. And the water was actually coming in through the windows.
Yeah, there about that of houses that had water on the first floor and people going upstairs. And in fact, the Zeb greenhouse where my Aunt Lucy was, I understand they had to go upstairs to get away from it for a little while.
Speaking of that, my dad was living with his aunt and uncle on Beaver Creek at the time, and he was taking care of the cow. And his uncle, Ab Marley, lived over there near where we have Liberal Mush Monday. The chimney is there on the corner. That was Uncle Ab's house. And my dad was going to spend the night that night with Uncle Ab. And he decided to go home. It started raining. And it was raining so hard he got scared, so he went home, and that they watched it. He would have been killed if he had not decided to go home. He was young.
It's called Smoot Park. It's a park, and it was a tannery at one time. And when the 40 flood came, it washed out the tannery from down on that end of town. And a lady, a friend of mine's mother, talked about there was a row of houses on what is now the CBD loop around North Wilkesboro, and she was talking about the flood. When the flood came, her family was going out in the back doors, the water was coming in the front doors.
Oh, wow.
So it was pretty devastating in North Wilkesboro. There was a place called Forster's New Way, and it had a zoo. They had bears and monkeys and things like that for people to look at, and it washed it completely away, animals and all.
Well, I am sure there's more stories to be told about Caldwell Wilkes than I'm aware of. I don't think it could have been that bad in Deep Gap and not been bad in these other surrounding areas. Okay, but thank you very much. Thank you for sharing. We'll be around if you have anything else you want to tell us.